we're going to ask Jon to come right now, and he's going to bring us the final message in our series and moments around the manger. Why don't you welcome Jon as he comes?
Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's really well and still in party mode. Hopefully we can change that this morning, because Phil gave me a marvelous text to preach from. I once was told when I sort of was first on my learning how to speak in front of people and learning how to preach and stuff, someone once told me, don't let the facts ruin a good story. And so in preparing for this message this morning, I read the text and realized that we may have to do that. Because Christmas, when I think of Christmas, it's kind of a beautiful time where we have a tree, or sort of a tree. We put our tree up, I think, at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. So we were a little bit late, but we have lights and we have... I've asked like 5 people about Christmas this morning. How was Christmas? And they've all said one thing: food. Food defines Christmas for a lot of people. Like, we think of a full table, we think of family, we think of celebration, we think of this wonderful time. And when we think about the story of Jesus and the nativity, we have the wise men, we have the angels, we have the gifts, we have kind of the stable, which is a bit dark, but it ends up being okay. Like, they make it kind of work. And then we come to a passage like we're going to be dealing with this morning, where essentially we're going to have to try and let the facts ruin a good story for a little bit. And maybe the first half of this morning we'll kind of dive into a pit of despair and hopelessness around the manger to somehow crawl our way back out into hope. So I hope you've come ready to be inspired by that story. We're going to just turn right to the story so you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to read from Matthew 2, chapter 13. Jared shared a couple of weeks ago from Matthew 1, and he came up with this beautiful analogy about Julie Andrews and John Coltrane. Put your hands up if you were here for that. Who thinks of that? It's really cool, though. So he talked about John Coltrane and learning to read the story with the context of the kind of the blues, this interpretation of a story that doesn't come from this joy and hope and happiness that we oftentimes carry into it, but from a sense of pain and suffering, but that can still see hope in the midst of pain and suffering. It's not as difficult to approach this story with that in mind. So starting from verse 13 of Matthew 2, it said, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up. He took the child and his mother during the night, and he left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel was weeping for her children and refused to be comforted because they are no more." Despair. I was overcome on Christmas Day. I was flicking through my Facebook feed in between sort of turkey and Christmas pudding, and I was just scrolling through, chilling out. The kids were playing with all their new toys. It was wonderful, and I was overwhelmed as I was looking through, because there was these 2 posts that sat right after each other. The first one was a story from detention, from Manus Island. It was a mother writing a few words about her daughter, who's going to spend the second year of her life in detention, locked up, and she was sort of saying "Merry Christmas" from behind bars, and you could hear the pain and the suffering in her voice. And I was reading it, kind of thinking, "Oh, that really sucks." And then the post directly after that was a friend of mine who's the pastor of a church, who was talking about, and he had a picture of the stage at their church, which was enormous. And filled with lights and filled with beauty and filled with all this sort of stuff. And he was talking about how much time and energy and money that they'd spent getting all of this ready and how cool it was. And I don't know, something about that paradox in front of me just overwhelmed me, thinking about this story, about the message and the heart of what Christmas truly is. Christmas is filled with the angels, and it's filled with the wise men, and it's filled with the manger and the beauty, and it's the introduction and birth of hope and joy and love, and all of those things are present. But sometimes we often forget that the story of Christmas is also surrounded by stories like this. That the introduction of hope into the world oftentimes forces us to be confronted with some very, very dark things all around us. One of the first stories that we have after Jesus is born is the mass genocide of a whole bunch of children under 2 years of age in the surrounding regions. And that's a hard thing to carry with us, but it's something that we have to not forget as we begin to carry through our understanding of what Christmas is all about. And it's really tempting to ignore stories like this because they do kind of disrupt the festivities and they do kind of interrupt our wonderful day, and I totally understand that. But I think if we can take the time and carefully begin to just enter into this story, maybe we'll be able to pull out what hope truly looks like. And not a hope wrapped in tinsel, but a hope that actually is able to journey through pain and through suffering and through hardship and still come out the other side with the declaration that a king has been born and he still reigns and he's still powerful. And I think that's maybe something that we need to do. There's on Christmas Day, 2 days ago, we were here 2 days ago, Phil shared a wonderful message. And in it, he talked about the Magnificat, which is Mary's prayer when Jesus is born. And so this morning, I want to just track through this story in no logical order, really, just the kind of the order that happens in my head, which is illogical. But maybe we can kind of piece the story together a bit like a jigsaw puzzle and try and journey through, like I said, that despair and helplessness into a place where we can understand what hope truly looks like in the midst of that. And so the first part of this morning, I want to talk about what the gospel is, and I want to talk specifically about the disturbance, what I've titled the disturbance of the gospel. And so what happens when the good news, the evangelion that Phil talked about on Christmas Day, what happens when the gospel is introduced into a society that doesn't actually want it, doesn't actually value it? What happens when a king is born but nobody wants a king, especially not one that looks like a child? What happens? And so we have Mary's prayer in Luke chapter 1, if we could put it up on the screen. And I want you to hear the overtones in this particular prayer, because what Mary is saying is so powerful. She's talking about a king who's been born in the form of a baby, but this baby is about to represent one of the biggest disturbances to the world that we've ever seen. It's filled with hope. It's filled with joy. The message of Jesus is that of compassion and mercy, but oftentimes when all of those things come head to head with all of these other things that we're going to see, things can get a little bit heated. This is Mary's prayer, if you can indulge me just again for a second. It says, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their innermost thoughts. He's brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. And he's filled the hungry with good things, but sent the rich away empty. He's helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors." What we have in the story of Matthew is, in one sense, the story of a baby introducing hope into the world. But in the other sense, what we have is this beauty and this glory and this hopefulness represented in this child against this man called Herod. There's a second century Jewish historian called Josephus who writes massively about this particular period in time. And he talks about Herod as being one of the most psychopathic rulers of his day. He was kind of like just a maniac who loved violence. And he would stop at nothing to continue to build his reputation, to continue to build his power, to continue to build his authority, including the complete massacre of all of the children under the age of 2, which some historians believe his children were also a part of that massacre. So what we have here is this guy who will stop at nothing to protect a sense of power and a sense of authority. And this guy who's got sort of so much power in this region is threatened by a 2-year-old boy. The question is why? And what we have here is a very strange example of the dynamics of power that happens when we begin to understand what the gospel is truly all about. See, I love the Magnificat in one sense because it's a wonderful prayer, and you can really hear Mary's heart and soul as she's sharing it. You can hear the awe and the wonder, and when we reflect back on Christmas Day and the video that we watched, we realize that one of Mary's things that she's dealing with is the fact that she's pregnant, and that means she should really be stoned in the society in which that she lived in. But she somehow carries this glorifying presence where she's saying, God, you've done so many amazing things. But in the midst of that, she gives us an insight into the purpose of this boy, what his hope will actually bring to the world. And for many of us, it represents something beautiful. But for some, for those that are more concerned with power than service, more concerned with authority than submission, more concerned with building their own reputations and protecting what they have, those that have this kind of sense of paranoia about their leadership, it says this, that he has brought down rulers from their thrones, but lifted up the humble. He's filled the hungry with good things, but he's sent the rich empty away. What we have is a powerful political statement about Jesus' role on the earth. When I say political, some of you are going, it's Christmas. Don't talk about politics. So I won't. It's all good. Because we can't let the facts spoil a good story. But the reality is that part of Jesus' role and function in the world is not just to come and fill us with turkey and good feelings and make us feel great about who we are. It's part of it sometimes. But another part of it is that he's come to bring a vision of what the world is supposed to look like and to inaugurate all of us into that story. And it began from the very beginning. This is the power of Mary's story. It's not just a cry saying, God, you are so good. It's a cry saying, look what this hope will do to all of those who stand against it. Light meets darkness. And from the very beginning, this 2-year-old boy represented a threat to all of those powers who used oppression and injustice and suffering and persecution to stand against everybody else. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and I was talking about this story and thanking Phil for the opportunity to talk about this 2 days after Christmas. And I was talking about the Herodians and kind of Herod and why he would do something like this. And they said, Herod, yeah, really kind of, I guess the modern day picture of Herod would be like ISIS. I said, I don't know. I was like, I reckon they kind of shared the same faith in many ways. I said, I think the Herodians would probably represent something a lot closer to home for us. We'll get there as we kind of move forward. See, the disturbance of the gospel is the realization that the moment Jesus entered our story, everything began to change. And for some of us, we're encapsulated by that beauty. Some of us are just so willing to step into that hope. Some of us have been longing for that reality in our lives, but some of us are threatened. Because some of us realize that in order for him to reign, we must stop, lay down our weapons, and pick up things that don't always look that attractive. To lay down our violence and our aggression, our systems of dominance, and all of these things that oppress people and hurt people, even our words and language and actions. And we have to pick up the tools that oftentimes don't look that attractive. Tools like love, which who even knows what that means. Tools like compassion and mercy and justice and faithfulness. And we have to replace the idea of being certain that we know what's going on with this strange, elusive thing called faith, where we trust a God who entered the world and began to change everything. It's a strange story. I got a gift for Christmas, a book written by one of my favorite authors, and in it he said this. It was a guy called Stanley Hauerwas, and he said, I simply do not believe that theology can be done as if our social and political considerations are an afterthought. And what he's meaning is that when we begin to think about theology, which is simply our musings about God and what it really means, and this is a time of year where everyone engages with theology because we think about this baby, we think about Jesus, we think about God being introduced to the world and what that means for all of us. When we think about that, we cannot think about that without thinking about what it means for society, what it means for the way that we govern ourselves, what it means for the way that everything is organized and how we can play a part in that. I'm not talking about just getting involved in politics or taking a side and being part of a party. That's not what I'm talking about. Hear my words. When I talk about the political dimensions of the gospel, what I mean is that Jesus has a vision for what the world is supposed to look like, and we are an integral part of that. Down to the very words that we speak every single day, we determine what world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world that's going to be fueled by violence and paranoia in order to protect our power and authority? Or do we want to live in a world where hope is beginning to infiltrate everything? That's the first part. So we're kind of at despair. Everyone's dead. It sucks. The second thing that I was reading this text that jumped out at me was the fact that the beginning of Jesus' life was displacement. We know that he was a refugee, right? He fled to Egypt to get away from persecution. Some of you are like, oh, here we go. It's just true. Again, we're kind of letting the facts spoil the story. But Jesus' life began with displacement, which is massive. The fact that the Son of God, the Savior of the world, our redeeming hope, the one that we gather around the tree to celebrate, then we gather around the table to celebrate, the one who is everywhere this time of year, the reason for the season, fled to Egypt to escape persecution and suffering and death because of someone that was out to get him. But what I want to focus on this morning is that I think it's easy for us. I think many of us could understand that because of the nature of this kind of displacement, because of the nature that we see Jesus as a refugee, and in fact so many people who were involved in the stories of the scriptures and writing the scriptures were themselves displaced people and refugees, that gives us a model of how to respond to refugees and people that are displaced. And I think many of us are on that wavelength. So we're going to take a different angle this morning. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the reality that the scriptures are continually talking about who we are and where we are placed in the grand story of God's plan. You don't need to look very far in the scriptures to realize that the people that God continually has a conversation with, the people who have a history of displacement, their lives begin with displacement. Let's just go to the Old Testament for a little bit and see some passages. Over and over again, you see in the Old Testament that when the Israelites, God's people, were trying to form themselves and they were trying to learn the ways of God and do the things that He'd asked them to do, they would continue kind of sway between being oppressed and then gaining a sense of power and then using that power to oppress others, and then they would like get invaded and then they'd be like, well, we're oppressed. And it was kind of this endless cycle. And so, but every time God was having a conversation with them, particularly when they were kind of entering the land that God had promised, He would have this kind of conversation. Do not oppress a foreigner. Why? Because you yourselves were once foreigners. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourselves. Why? Because you were once foreigners in Egypt. Every time that the Israelites began to persecute or exclude or alienate somebody else, God would come back and say, oh, hey, do you remember when you were alienated? Do you remember when you were excluded? Do you remember when you were left out and you were crying to me saying, help me, help me, help me, and I helped you, and then you persecute everybody else? Did you see the logic in that story? You go into the New Testament, we find similar conversations happening over and over again. If you can click to the next slide, where it says, hey, there is no longer Jew or Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all in all. He's beginning to break down divisions between us. He's beginning to break down all of the animosity between us and say, actually, it's no longer about us and them. It's no longer about you and me. It's no longer about the things that are in the middle between us, but actually what brings us together. And so, but that's incredibly hard, to be part of a narrative that brings together instead of defines the difference between us. And what I realized is that to actually begin to engage with the reality of God's vision, and his vision was for a kingdom, not an empire. The kingdom looks a lot like bringing people together. And that's really powerful. A theologian that I love called Jon Bergmann, when he was reading the Magnificat, said that the Magnificat, Mary's prayer at the very beginning of Luke's gospel, tells us that from the very day that Jesus was born, he was on a collision course with the Roman Empire. He was on a collision course with the Jewish authorities. Not because he wanted to take them down, but because what they were building was not the kingdom that he represented. And it could never survive. This is one of the paradoxes for me when I scrolled through my Facebook feed and saw those two pictures, one next to the other. One of someone who was persecuted and suffering and spending another year in detention for the crime of fleeing to Egypt. And the other who was pouring time and money and energy into building something that people could look at and go, that's nice. And I realized that we need to make the distinction between whether we're building a kingdom or an empire and which side we begin to stand on and what defines the rules on each side, if that makes sense. Maybe I'm just rambling a little bit now. See, what's happening here is that Jesus, but not only Jesus, what he represented, the vision of a new kingdom, a new reality, a new way of doing things, has come head to head with an empire that already knows how to do things. We know how to keep people safe. We know how to keep people in line. We know how to govern. We know how to rule. We know how to put systems in place. And if you step outside the system, that's when we're going to have a problem. And this is what Jesus is coming up against. This is why the gospel is political in one sense, because there are certain things that we look at in life, in our own systems, in our own structures, and we say, it is just my faith that inhibits me from being able to adhere with this. Because I represent a vision for a new society, a new way of doing things, where violence is not the answer and can never be the answer. And hope looks a lot like a 2-year-old boy. That's a strange message to have this time of year. I was sort of reflecting on Jesus' life beginning in displacement. I started to think about my own life a little bit, not because I wasn't born in a stable or wasn't persecuted by anybody, didn't have to flee. But I started to sort of feel a little bit like I've been displaced a lot of my life. And I don't want to dishonor anybody who has actually been displaced or actually been a refugee and had to flee from suffering and pain. But as I was reflecting on some of the things in my own life, I began to realize that there are moments when I've sort of been filled with despair and hopelessness. And the reason is that I feel like I don't fit in. When I was a kid, my dad moved a fair amount. So we went to a number of different schools. Each school that I went to, you have to learn a new dialogue. It was in England as well, so the accents, like when you move half an hour, the accents completely change. You know what I'm talking about, right? Different accents, different places. And so we moved all over the place. And so each school was a new accent, a new friendship group, it's like a new subculture. Each city, it's just crazy. Different infrastructure, different football team. And it completely defines it. So every school I went to, I had to learn a new culture, a new dialogue, a new accent. And so when I came to Australia, within the first 6 months, I'd kind of developed this Australian hybrid of an accent sort of thing to try and fit in. And I realized that throughout growing up, there'd been moments where I'd never really sort of fit in. But there was this particular moment that I remember when I was really comfortable in life. I was going through college and kind of getting my studies right, and I had this encounter with Jesus. And I had this encounter with Jesus in a church. It was kind of amazing, really. It's where I met my beautiful wife, and I was going through a rough patch in my life, and I came to this church because my mum told me that I should go to church, so I did. And I went there, and there was a guy speaking, and I was so overwhelmed, not with him, but just with the message of Jesus, and something caught me by surprise, and I did what I was told, and I put my hand up at the end of the service. I went to the front. And that was it. I was saved. I was in. It was great. I got my ticket up. But something happened in that moment that I can't really explain. But as I was preparing, I realized that I think it was at that moment that I was displaced by the gospel in a way that separated me from so many other things. Not that I was special, not that I was elected, but that the reality of the gospel, as it had kind of permeated my soul, meant that I no longer belonged in so many places. And so I thought, well, I sort of don't know, I no longer fit within my friendship circle. I no longer fit in these different spaces that I've been, so I'm going to go to church, because at least I'll fit there. Right? Yeah, that's right, laughing. We came to Australia a couple of months later. We emigrated over here, another place. And so I found a church to fit into. I started attending Bible college. I started studying Jesus. This Jesus I've fallen in love with so much, and the Jesus who inspired my soul. And I was reading more about him in the scriptures and just coming alive with the beauty of the gospel. But then there was this other side of my life that was church. I was also learning things about Jesus, but they were different. And I was kind of taken aback by this split in my life between learning about a God who came into the world and allowed you not to bypass suffering, but kind of navigate through it. And then I was learning another story over here, which was talking to me about how to lead by manipulating people and how to be strong and powerful and authoritative, just like the Herodians. And I was overwhelmed by the reality that once again I didn't fit into this place. So I ended up leaving and moving into a new space, new church. And this was a wonderful space, actually, to be honest. And there was a lot of healing in this space. And that was a Baptist church that I started going to. And that's when I started lecturing at Bible college. And I used to start all of my theology lectures by saying, I was raised Catholic, and I studied at a Catholic university. I also teach at a Pentecostal Bible college, and I attend a Baptist church. So I don't have a clue what's going on. Let's have fun for this semester, like navigating it ourselves. But again, after a few years at this church, I began to speak, and I began to get a vision of what Jesus' kingdom really represented, and the political dimensions in terms of how we are called to step into the world, not retreat from the world. And again, I felt displaced. I felt like I was shouting. We had a meeting one time at the church, and I came home, and he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "I feel like I want to slam my head through a brick wall." How do you feel? Because such was my longing to bring this reality of God, maybe even just to myself. But so often I felt like the reality of this good news, but all of the dimensions that it contained, made me displaced. Because I love the story of Christmas and the beauty and the hope and the tinsel and the food. I love it. But we cannot forget the darkness that ensued the reality of Jesus' birth into the world. We can't neglect that the beginning of his life was poverty and genocide and displacement. Like, that's the beginning of our story. And so when we begin to try and build something that looks a lot like empire, we forget that we're called to step into the kingdom. That's why I was overwhelmed on Christmas Day with those two photos, because I realized that one picture made my heart bleed, and the other one made me furious. Because we so often try and build something that looks nothing like Jesus. And this story's really helped me with that, I think. So we're going to move on to the final part. I'm trying to hopefully crawl back from this despair. We're going to move to talk about Mary and Joseph, and it's outstanding to look at Mary and Joseph and their response to the vision of God, the dreams that Joseph has. And Jared talked a lot about Joseph and his dreams a couple of weeks ago, and Phil mentioned Mary on Christmas Day and all the things that she was dealing with. I mean, to be taking this journey to have this child, and then to have this child and be surrounded by people, we're dealing with such feelings of shame, but also feelings of fear in terms of what kind of awaits when you step out of that stable. And there's so much going on all around them. But the response is that Joseph has a dream, he hears the call, and he just goes. And that is one of the most inspiring things that I've ever heard, because it's not the call to go and bypass the reality of our suffering. It's not a call to leave and to try and escape or even try and overcome all of the darkness, but it's a call to go and step out into displacement, to move through the pain and suffering, realizing that it is all around you, but to come through it with some strange sense of hope. I was talking about this with my brother, and he reminded me of a beautiful passage in Exodus. I'd love to turn. I don't know what the next slide is, but we go to Exodus 14, just to kind of highlight the power of this story. We know the story of the Exodus, right? I might just paraphrase it. So Moses has gone into Egypt. He's had this confrontation with Pharaoh. Again, we have a kingdom versus an empire. Kind of have different dimensions of reality colliding against each other, and that often results in this kind of intense violence. So Pharaoh's like, sure, you can go. And then he changes his mind and starts pursuing the Israelites. And they're all kind of running out of Egypt. And they get to a big body of water. And then the Israelites do what they did for a while after that and go, oh, it's all over. Like, they're just depressed. They're like, we've fled. That was so stupid. Why did we do that? Moses, you've just led us here to die, haven't you? That was your plan all along. There wasn't enough graves in Egypt, so you just led us out here to die instead. And he starts praying to God. God will deliver us. And then God's response in Exodus 14, it's like, why are you praying? Run! Just go! It's just this amazing kind of picture of these people. And Moses, I just love the picture of Moses. It's just like, you know, he doesn't even want to do this. We've got to remember that. At the burning bush, we would be like, God's alive. And he's like, really? You want me? Seriously? And then he goes in, he does this stuff, and they're all following him, like running. And then they're all like, oh, this is so bad. Like, you've just liberated us from Egypt. And Moses is like, are you serious? Look what he's just done. And then he starts praying, and God says, just shut up and keep running. And as he runs, the water parts, and they all run through. And we know the story, but it's an amazing story because it represents these moments when oftentimes we come to God in the midst of chaos, in the midst of, like, they weren't going to turn around and go, you know what, we're going to overcome. We're going to turn around and fight these Egyptians because we believe that God is strong. God's like, you should definitely run. But I'll be with you when you're running. I'll run with you. I don't really know what that means. But when we come back to Matthew 2 and the significance of what Matthew's doing through his gospel is trying to tell us that what Jesus is doing is very similar to what Moses is doing in bringing us an exodus, a liberation from something. What he's saying, do you hear the allusions in the story? I mean, Herod killed all of the children under 2. Do you remember what happened around the time of Moses? Pharaoh killed all of the children under the age of 2. There's similarities in this story because Jesus is like Moses in that he's come to liberate us. And our response is to just go. To hear a voice, to see a dream, and to carry a vision, but to respond to it. To keep moving through. This is the power of the end of this story. And this is how we can somehow begin to crawl up from that desperation and that picture of genocide and displacement and helplessness, is to realize that when God has called, not just you and me, but us, he gives us a vision and he speaks to us in dreams. And our job is to say, sure, let's do this. Let's walk through this massive ocean. Let's go to Egypt. It's strange. And so let's just read the last part of the story here in Matthew as we sort of come to a close. It said, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Egypt, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. So he got up, took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. It's amazing how it's this vision and dream that is just guiding Joseph. I mean, I love that in itself. And how many times have we sat down and gone, God, just give me a sign, give me a dream, give me something. You know, and I wish this happened to me. I wish like I just needed like direction. I could go to sleep. Sounds like an awesome plan, right? I need to pray. I'm just going to go to sleep. And he's going to reveal himself to me in a dream. It doesn't always happen like that, does it? All the time we ask for a sign. Sometimes we get it. There's been moments in life when I've known something that I shouldn't know, and I've known it with complete certainty. But there's other times in life when I've just had a sense and a feeling about what I should do. And I want to just honor both of those things this morning, as there's some people here I know who hear God speak in powerful, clear, decisive ways. And they go, God's spoken, I'm going to do that. Those people intimidate me. One, because I'm not sure if they're always telling the truth. And secondly, because sometimes they are. And both of those are terrifying. But whether or not you see dreams, or you hear voices, I talk to people about, like, coming to faith. It's crazy. It's like, yeah, you get some dreams, hear voices. It makes it sound like a really strange bunch of people. We follow a God that we can't really see and listen to him. We can't really hear him. And that's all good. Anyway, I don't know what I was talking about. Joseph stuff. Some people hear. But regardless of whether you do or not, we all have a vision to work towards. We all know how we can respond. We all know what to do. And we see the beginnings of it here in the story of Jesus as even a little boy, how he responded. But more particularly in this instance, how Mary and Joseph responded. In the midst of their own chaos and their own suffering and their own persecution, they responded. They heard the call, they saw the dream, they had the vision, and they just left. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judah, the place of his father, he was afraid to go there, having been warned in a dream, another dream. He withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth, and so fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So all of this, we find in the end, was the fulfillment of prophecy. All of it was part of God's plan. And we have a language of God's plan that often makes us feel really good in times that are really bad. But how many people know that when you're going through suffering and pain and hardship, especially the worst kind, and someone says, don't worry, God's got a plan, it doesn't actually help, does it? It kind of makes you feel even worse. You're like, this is God's plan. Great idea, God. But it's afterwards, when you look back and you see everything that's happened, and you realize that there was no way that any of that could have come about had you not gone through what you'd gone through. You know, I'm not going to be cliched enough to say that out of all the bad things, good things come, because sometimes they don't. But the reality is that when we look back on this story, the genocide, the displacement, the running, the fear, we look back and realize that it was all part of a plan. There was a purpose to it all, and it teaches us some invaluable lessons about how to navigate our own suffering and pain, but also how to step into a world that so often is filled with the same kind of systems that try and protect their own authority and power through paranoia and violence and oppression. And we're challenged not just to resist ourselves from becoming that, but from resisting that in the world around us, and in so doing, creating a world of peace and hope. And someone once asked me what my sort of vision for the end is. You know, they're asking about my theology. What's your theology of the end? It's like people love to ask you those questions, and they then put you in a box and figure out whether you're a heretic or not. And he's like, what do you think the end's going to be like? I was like, I don't know. I kind of just think that when Jesus came into the world, he gave us a picture of a world the way it was supposed to be. And I'm going to work as hard as I can to try and make that a reality in our lives today, knowing that I might not be able to do it, but that hopefully by his grace I'll be able to see a glimpse of it and hope that that's good enough. And this is the story we have in this story, is the collision of despair with hope, tragedy and beauty, all in the same moment. And it's the ultimate paradox. It's the story of Christianity. It's the story of a child who was redeeming the world, born in a stable, in the same way that we have the Savior redeeming the world hanging on a cross. None of it makes sense in one sense, but in another sense it makes perfect sense, if that makes sense, which it probably doesn't. So I'm going to finish with a quote from one of my good friends who I've never met and never spoken to, but would like to one day. Tom Wright, if any of you know him, he's awesome. He talks about this vision that we carry and how we begin to move forward. And so when we read the story of Jesus and we don't neglect the darker moments, but instead navigate through them realizing who he is, We come face to face with a vision of what the world is supposed to be like. And I love Tom Wright because he's a poet, and he says beautiful things. He says, we dream the dream of justice, and justice is just the world being put right. Maybe it's more complicated than that, but that's what it is for me. The world being put to rights. He said, when we dream the dream of justice, we glimpse for a moment a world at one, a world put to rights, a world where things work out, where societies function healthily, where I not only know what I ought to do, but I actually do it. I love that bit. I not only see the dream, but I get up and I go. And then we wake up and we come back to reality. That's the story for so many of us, including myself. We dream that dream and then we wake up and we walk outside and we go, how could I be a part of the solution? It is as though we can hear a voice speaking with calm, healing authority, speaking about justice, about things being put to rights, about peace and hope and prosperity for all. And this voice continues to echo in our imaginations. And so my prayer as we finish and come around the table this morning is that this voice would continue to echo in our imaginations, that we would remember the story of Christmas in all of its beauty, all of its glory, all of its hope, but also all of its darkness, realizing that Jesus, the introduction of hope into the human story, allows us not to bypass it, but to move through it. And in doing so, we become the hope that he asks us to become. And we begin to glimpse in very small ways what the world is supposed to look like. Let's pray as we come around the table. Lord, every time we come to your word, we're challenged in a new way, oftentimes a painful way. And so we just ask that the gospel for us would not be a gospel that affirms where we are and what we're doing, but instead brings a sense of disturbance, maybe restlessness, maybe a sense that there is more, that we can't be certain, but instead we need to trust and have faith. We thank you that the beginning of our story, the beginning of our hope, was displacement and darkness, but how hope can overcome all of that. And we thank you for the example of Mary and Joseph and their response to the vision that you gave them and the dreams that they had. And we just pray for that same kind of strength in our own lives, for people that would be able to see the vision of what the world should be, to hear the dreams of where we fit into the middle of that, but also to respond to that, which oftentimes takes enormous faith and tremendous courage. We pray that we would understand where we came from, but also know that you've given us a picture of where we're going. And by your Holy Spirit, fill us with the peace and the strength and the courage to begin to move there. We pray all of that in your mighty name. Amen.